Our second reading comes from 1 Samuel chapter 13. And I'll just tell you now that the little ellipses are there because folks who go back and look at the manuscripts don't know what goes in those spots. So I'm not just skipping his age so that we don't talk about how old he is, okay? Saul was years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 2 years over Israel. Saul chose 3,000 out of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash, in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent home to their tents. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." When all Israel heard that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines, the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, and 6,000 horsemen, and troops like the sand of the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped at Michmash, to the east of Beth-aven. When the Israelites saw that they were in distress, for the troops were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves and in holes, and in rocks, and in tombs, and in cisterns. Some Hebrews crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him with trembling. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people began to slip away from Saul. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me, and the offerings of well-being." And he offered the burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to meet him and salute him. Samuel said, "What have you done?" Saul replied, "When I saw that the people were slipping away from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines were mustering at Michmash, I said, 'Now the Philistines will come down upon me at Gilgal,' and I have not entreated the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. The Lord would not establish your kingdom over Israel forever." The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him to be ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And Samuel left and went on his way from Gilgal. The rest of the people followed Saul to join the army. They went up from Gilgal toward Gibeah of Benjamin. Saul counted the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Let us pray. Almighty God, allow us this day to hear your word and to remember to obey. Amen. It is good to be king, except for when you're Saul. Saul was Israel's first king. But before we get to him being anointed, a little bit of background. So we remember that the people of Israel have fled slavery in Egypt, and they have settled in what today we know of as the area of Palestine. The troops are loosely aligned and have called up a volunteer army when the Philistines come to attack and reclaim land. They were governed during the majority of this time by judges, my favorite, of course, being Deborah. But then they looked around and they were jealous. All the other people around them had kings. They wanted a king too. They wanted to be like the other kids on the playground and have exactly the same thing. And in 1 Samuel 8, we hear of the last judge, Samuel. He is approached by the elders of Israel who come to him demanding, "You are old." Not the best way to start a discussion, right? "You are old and your sons do not follow your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like the other nations." But they are not supposed to be like the other nations. They are to recognize God as their leader and not need a king. This ask for a king was rejection of God's care and direction. But they keep asking, despite Samuel's warning of what a king would be. The king would take the best of their harvest, demand armies to be called up, devote abundant resources to war, take the best of the wine and of the vineyards, take pretty much whatever they wanted, causing oppression to ensue. But the people don't hear, and they continue to demand. They want to be like other nations. They want a king. After multiple rounds, we hear the Lord instruct Samuel to set a king over them. And so Samuel sets out to anoint a king. And that king is Saul. And it becomes his primary task to defeat the Philistines. Saul is anointed in chapter 10 with what I would not call welcoming words. Samuel says, "But today you rejected your God, who saves you from all calamities and your distress, and you have said, 'No, set a king over us.' Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and your clans." From the very beginning, it does not seem good for Saul. His very identity as king defies God. And so for those that have taken any English classes and learned about foreshadowing, we know that something bad is going to happen to Saul. And this is where our story continues this morning. Saul and 3,000 troops are ready for battle. The Philistines had troops like sands of the seashore. That's a lot of troops. For any of us who have ever tried to wipe the sand off a toddler's hands, we know that the sands of the seashore is a lot of people. And they are there waiting for Samuel to arrive. He was to come and offer the required offerings before they went to war. He said, "Wait, and I will come in 7 days." This passage of time leads to the Israelites to begin to get nervous. And some of them say, "I'm done waiting, I'm returning home." Others go and hide. They do not want to wait for Samuel. And Saul begins to get nervous, seeing that the troops are leaving him, and he knows that he needs each and every one of those troops to be able to defeat the Philistines. So what happens? What does he do? Saul thought that Samuel would be there, and he's not there, and he knows he shouldn't go to war before these offerings are offered. And so Saul gives in to the desires of the people, and he makes the sacrifices himself, defying the direct instructions that he had received from Samuel to wait until he got there on day 7 to make these offerings. Now, I have to be careful here prior to condemning Saul's actions. If something is told to me that it'll be done on such and such a date, it better be done on such and such a date. John and I and Kian all applied for the renewal of Kian's passport on May 26th. We were told it would take 7 to 9 weeks to get this passport back, despite paying extra for it to be expedited. 9 weeks came and went. We then hit 10 weeks. I became very frustrated. I did contact my representative's office saying, "Where is the passport?" If I could have made that passport myself, you know I would have. And so I understand Saul. He was told Samuel would get there after 7 days and offer the burnt offerings to God. And he wasn't there. And so I have a little bit of compassion for Saul, but I'm also able to hopefully learn an important lesson. We are to obey God. We are to listen to the instructions presented to us. Because Samuel does arrive on day 7 and asks Saul, "What have you done? Why didn't you obey?" We are told that because Saul did not obey, his kingship would be over. Due to his disobedience, Saul's reign would come to an end, and his heirs would not have the opportunity to be king. I understand in some ways why Saul did what he did. We too at times get impatient, and we think that the ends will justify the means. If I do this and we still are able to defeat the Philistines, it doesn't matter that I disobeyed God. But it is quite clear here in this story that the means do not justify the ends. We are to listen to God, to not disobey, but to follow God's instructions and teachings. And when we don't, when we disobey God, when we sin, there are consequences. We are told quite clearly, and thank God, that God does forgive us when we sin and empower us to return to God, to return to living in the way that Christ desires of us. We are forgiven, but there are still consequences to our sin. And the story of Saul reinforces that for us. And those consequences can be great. And at times, we won't know the full consequences of our sin when we commit that sin. John and I began watching Suits this summer, not knowing that it would be one of the top-rated programs for us to watch on, I believe, Netflix. I get confused of what streams what. We are finally getting to see Princess Megan prior to her being princess. as she is on this TV show. The entirety of Suits is based upon the effects of one lie, and not knowing all of the other lies, the other behaviors, the other actions that will be required to maintain that one lie. In our lives, we will not know all of the impacts of us disobeying God. Impacts that can last for generations. Saul's disobedience meant that he would be removed from the throne, and that generations that came after him sitting on the throne would not be part of his lineage. The ways in which we sin, the ways in which we disobey God will have impacts beyond our own lives. I was having one of those mother-daughter conversations, and Kara said, "There's no racism anymore, right? We've figured that out." And she's 16, she's still learning. And we began one of those good conversations that the actions of those before her continue to have impacts today that last in ways that we cannot fully anticipate. And we are to, yes, seek God's forgiveness for those wrongdoings, but also seek for ways to create space for God's justice and righteousness, to seek how it is that we can somehow overcome the sins of our predecessors. We, the people of Holy Cross, are an inclusive, welcoming community committed to sharing God's love unconditionally. We admit that we have disobeyed God. We too have sinned and fallen short of that which God intended for us. We have sinned, and so have generations that have gone before us. And so, as a people who love God, we seek to find ways to bring healing, to bring wholeness, to take away the harm that has been done. We learn from Saul that we are to obey God. We are to listen to God, to be people who love God with our entire being, and who seek God's goodness for ourselves and others. Let us be a people who obey, a people who love God and love me.